let's go to bed.
Hello and welcome to the Follycast, the podcast devoted to the Rivers of London series by Ben Aaronovitch. Today we're discussing Book 4, Broken Homes. This is Margaret in Sutton,
Richard in Fulham,
Jan in Worcester,
and Jenny in Muswell Hill.
Now, this is a pivotal book, so be warned. We'll be discussing major plot points and in particular the explosive ending.
If you've been listening to the Follycast before, you may have realised that whilst Margaret and I are rereading the series, Jan and Jenny are reading for the first time. To be fair to them and to listeners who've been reading along at home before each podcast, and I have heard from quite a few people who are doing that, we will do our best not to reveal spoilers after Broken Homes. If we notice any when editing, we'll bleep them out with a spoiler siren.
So, in Broken Homes, we start year 2 of our adventures with the team at the Folly. Here's a quick reminder if you read the book a while ago. Quite a lot happens in this book. Peter finds a whole new set of senior officers to annoy as bodies pile up in the home counties and in South London, whilst D.I.'s Sewell and Stephanopoulos are probably delighted to have time off from working with Peter and Nightingale. Peter's interest in architecture, which we've questioned in the last podcast, comes in extremely handy when all roads lead to the Skygarden Tower, a fictional but strangely familiar tower block in the Elephant and Castle.
Peter and Lesley move in together, but not in the way many of us were probably hoping for back when we were reading book 1. Zach pops in from time to time like Kramer from Seinfeld to steal cereal, host sleepovers with quiet people and get it together with Lesley. We get the most action with the Rivers of London themselves so far since the first book. We experience a trippy spring court on the South Bank, which is attended by nearly all our growing cast of characters, and some new ones, including Reynard the Fox and our youngest river yet, Nicky. And yes, finally, Beverly Brook is back on the scene. Meanwhile, trees are attacked with chainsaws, leading to arguably the most shocking death in the series so far, as we meet and then mourn Sky, the tree nymph.
Meanwhile, Nightingale manages to lay waste to a farmhouse and a dogfighting venue without losing a single crease in his finely tailored trousers. The Night Witch from Whispers Underground is finally caught and put under house arrest at the Folly, so now Molly has someone else to cook for. Having subjected Covent Garden to a riot and a flood and ambushed an ambulance in previous books, Peter has a skyscraper crash down around him. And we only have to imagine the paperwork that he's going to fill in after this. The Faceless Man is back and his plans to create one big magic wand is thwarted. However, he remains on the loose and we get our "Luke, I am your father" shock as Lesley embraces the dark side. This has been a huge relief to Richard and I, who've had to be so careful not to let this out of the bag in the previous 3 episodes.
So things will never be the same again, and we're left wondering, why is Beverly so keen to speak to Peter? Will Lesley get her face back, but at what price? What is the secret behind the steel door underneath the Folly? Will Peter's dad get a new set of teeth? And perhaps most worryingly of all, just what is Molly up to on Peter's PC? These questions and many others will be answered in the next episode. Perhaps.
Okay, so what did we think of Broken Homes? I think we probably do need to start with the end, so to speak, and talk about Lesley. Was it a surprise and did you see it coming?
No, not at all. But then I thought, why didn't I see it coming? So I have, although I read this one really quickly, I have been trying to go back and see if there were any clues. And in particular, if there was any idea that Nightingale knew it was coming. So I've looked for how he was separating Lesley and Peter in the kind of the final chapters, you go there, you go there. But there's a small part of me that says, has she gone to the dark side?
Mm.
Well,
Which would be another reason for Nightingale separating her out. And maybe he was aware of what was going on.
Well, this is something Zach says in the very final scene.
Yeah,
isn't
he
it?
does,
Perhaps she's gone undercover, but
yeah.
It's interesting because I guess the point would be if she has gone undercover, given that Peter had the Faceless Man in handcuffs, effectively, hadn't they nearly solved it?
Well, maybe they haven't.
I hadn't picked up on the Nightingale thing at all. That's really interesting. That you think he might have been suspicious and was handling her carefully.
Either that or he was in the know and she hasn't gone to the dark side. This is a special project for her.
Ah.
No, but then you'll know that. And now I don't want you to say anything.
Well, like Jenny, absolutely did not see it coming. I was really, really shocked. But I did go back again to try and see if there were any clues that I'd missed. And there is, at one point, I still keep thinking of her as Varenka, but she's referred to as Varvara now, isn't she? The Russian major. And she does actually say that she wonders whether the faceless one is actually working on faces. The Richard Vile victim that had her face, with a shotgun, she said she wonders if he'd actually been working on her face. So I wondered if that was some sort of clue, which I definitely, incidentally, hadn't picked up on. It was only
But if
when
I was
went
Lesley,
back.
I'd be really worried about that, because she had to destroy her face because it didn't work, presumably.
But I hadn't picked up on it. I was really shocked. And also, I can't really accept that the Lesley that we've grown to like so much has suddenly completely gone to the dark side. So I can see that she may have been tempted, as Peter says, by the thought that he could do something to help her. And whether she's making this sort of Faustian pact that she'll go there and help him if he does this, but then she plans to come back and try and get out of it. Or whether, as Zach suggests, she's just going to play it, as a double agent. But it definitely sets up so much anticipation for the next book. So I can't wait really to get to the next one. And totally 100%, I don't want any clues.
because I know how long it takes sometimes for these stories to pick up again. It could be another 4 books before we find out what happened.
I'm reassured that it did come as a shock to both of you, because at least that means that Margaret and I were able to cover up for 3 books, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely.
So I took out a question from the last podcast just in case it led us to spill the beans, really.
I had a question that was slightly loaded. It said, "Are we sure Lesley's totally okay?" Which Margaret said, no, that's...
We're not going there. Did it make sense in hindsight, having looked at it and then dealt with the shock? Did it sort of make sense in hindsight? Could you see perhaps when she might have started to turn?
Well, I tried to work out when it was that he'd approached her or when they'd got together. And I couldn't see that happening recently because she was living in the Folly and she's so actively involved in the plot. So I thought it must have happened quite soon after she went home, after the injury.
That
far back? Oh.
Yeah. I still can't square it with what I thought I knew about Lesley. That of course she's angry with Peter, she's angry with everybody for doing this to her. But she's also sensible enough to know that she doesn't just get a face. Her whole life is ruined by the face. She's got a livable life at the moment, but she can't, if you hook up with the faceless one, then that's it. You're not coming back. She must have been aware of that. So why would she take that route? It didn't seem feasible.
Unless, I don't think, this has literally just popped into my head, but the suicide under the train, and they were mulling over whether he could have been forced to do that. You don't think that there's been some way of compelling
her.
Lesley to suddenly not allow Peter to remove the mask. I don't think that's fully the impression we're left with at the end, if we look at Peter and Zach's conversation. But I wonder whether that's a possibility, because they were definitely at the beginning of the book talking about how people can be made to do things that they don't necessarily lose control.
It's a damn good plot twist, really good.
It is.
I've got a couple of theories, but again, Rich has probably got other ones as well. There's a couple of things, having read it the second time and knowing what was coming in terms of when do I think this happened, there's a couple of things. There's a point where he goes down to Bromley to the locksmith and he goes into the house and he can't get hold of Lesley at all, and Nightingale. Nightingale's quite common because he doesn't use his phone, but he can't get hold of Lesley at all. There's a whole thing about her wearing a different mask that's tan coloured, which is exactly the same colour that he notes that the faceless man wears on the roof. And also what I found quite interesting, if you look back, there's a few times when she says, well, it may not be the faceless man. And in the other 2 books, again, this is just maybe me overthinking it, it's Lesley who does all the connections behind about how all the organisations connect together. And she doesn't in this book. In the first book, she sort of connects how they all work together. And definitely in Whispers Underground, it was her that works out all the connections. And none of that tends to come from Lesley. And that actually comes from Peter about County Guard. And he goes and sees Jake, who gives him all that information. But normally it's Lesley behind the scenes who's doing that groundwork policing that doesn't seem to happen from her in this book. But I mean, maybe I'm just overthinking that. But
no, I don't think so. I mean, obviously it's strange rereading it. That's one of the reasons I was looking forward to rereading it. I mean, not the only reason. I mean, in my view, this would be an excellent book even if Lesley hadn't turned. The whole plot and everything, which we'll come on to, and Skygarden Tower and everything is fascinating. In terms of rereading it, inevitably you've got your eyes open for any clues as to whether the author is seeding in anything. And there aren't any, oh my God, I can't believe I missed that clues. None of them would have made you think, oh, I'm so stupid, it was hidden in plain sight, because there isn't anything like that. But there are some subtle pointers that, for me, there's a pivotal bit is the scene outside the fair at Camden Lock where suddenly everyone realises Lesley's got her mask off and the crowd is staring at her and taking smartphone pictures and the little girl's crying, and you wonder what effect that has on Lesley. And then by contrast, when she's hanging out with Zach in the demi-monde at nightclubs, she actually says they don't care whether they've got the mask on or off. They don't see you. They aren't like you and Nightingale. These people don't care. I'm quoting it. These people don't care. In fact, they don't even notice. So whether there's an element of her starting to doubt the straightforward world of policing and that things are a bit greyer, not less black and white. And then there's also when Sky's murdered and they think that Nicky's drowned them in the car. When Peter says, but she's only 9 years old, Leslie says, I don't know what she is. I know one thing, the law doesn't seem to apply to her or to her mum or any of these fucking people. And if it doesn't apply to them, why does it apply to us? So
but also what he's done before, particularly in the first one and Punch and Judy, is he's signalled later in the book when everything happens and Punch and Judy are identified, or the Punch and Judy connection is identified. He signals it for you. Nightingale says, "Well, actually, you missed that clue and you missed this clue." The beauty of the way this was done this time is it's tiny. Yeah, it's just a turn of a heel and a taser, and it's half a page. And yet it's a devastating piece of news, but it's covered so slightly.
Yeah, you're right. If Hollywood did it, there would be a lot of exposition. With Lesley, everyone frozen, and Lesley explaining to us and to the camera why she's doing this.
He doesn't even look at her. He can't see her. He's on the ground. She turns her heel and goes.
I mean, Margaret mentioned the Luke, I am your father bit from The Empire Strikes Back, but even that has got a fair bit of exposition in it. It's not quite that simple, whereas you're right, this is quite minimalist in how it's handled, but very effectively. Sometimes people who are very invested in characters can also feel that they slightly own them themselves and that character wouldn't do that. Game of Thrones is a classic example of this, where the final series, most of the fans were saying, my favourite character would not do that. Did you have any reaction of betrayal from the author in terms of doing that to the character, or did it make perfect sense?
Well, I think when it happened, it did make me think back to the book where she was taken over before, wasn't she? So it did make me think back to that and think, oh, this has happened to her once before, where she suddenly behaved in a way that you wouldn't expect. To me now, I'm desperate to know whether in the next book she's going to turn up with the faceless one so that she's his accomplice, or whether we're going to find her back at the Folly and we get an explanation of what she was doing, and suddenly, her face is as it was right at the beginning of book one, but she's in great danger from the faceless one. So I think there's all sorts of ways it could go next.
I'm kind of not expecting anything immediate.
Oh, interesting.
But because I think if it was me, then my focus would be on the impact on Peter. because he hasn't actually had much luck with women at all. Simone is another one who's he's assumed was okay and turns out not to be. So women actually showing their dark sides in front of Peter is probably something that's going to seriously impact him.
We don't see that much introspection from Peter, do we?
We see anger sometimes. We see he loses control, but we don't see introspection so much.
Do you not also think that because he has to do so much in terms of securing the Folly and just checking that everything's okay, and then you get that last very sort of quiet scene with the quiet people and Zach in the nightclub, pretty much that it's almost like the author didn't want too much at the end, because you don't want to get away from the shock of what's actually happened to Peter and Lesley, and then possibly that's more going to ripple through books to come, rather than you sometimes have a big reveal and then sometimes you have about 30 pages afterwards. And I think he wanted to keep as much as the end.
I'm surprised he didn't end it on that turning of the heel.
That's an interesting point, isn't it? Because there is about another 10 pages after that, isn't there?
There is, and there's also again a bit of humour. I always like humour, particularly when things are going pear-shaped, about the quiet people's choices on the jukebox, where they're
Dire Straits.
they're working their way through the last 150 years of musical history.
And actually, I think that's the first time that music has made such a big appearance in a kind of concentrated way, and it happens to be that music.
And there's also the running joke, isn't it, that sounds like the quiet people have come to the rescue of Crossrail and it's backlog of work that needs doing.
Yeah. I thought it was quite a nice touch that Peter also came across Stephen, who had buried him underground. And said, we thought you needed a rest. And again, no big drama on, whereas Peter was obviously completely traumatised by what had happened. But again, he didn't dwell on it, it just sort of moves on, doesn't it?
Should we talk a little bit more about Nightingale, one of our favourite characters? And he does feature a little bit more in this book. We learn a little bit more about his childhood and a little bit more about his background. And he is more present in this book than he is in perhaps the previous one or two before. What do we feel about Nightingale and how he's written in this book?
It's not much of a bigger picture, although I think the main thing is that he is... I started to get worried about whether he was losing his touch in the previous books, and this time he seems to exercise much more control. And more importantly, much more control and knowledge than the Faceless Man. So his superiority, I think, shines a bit more strongly in this book than it has before. And you keep discovering stuff that the Faceless Man didn't know.
Yes.
And Nightingale does. And he makes swords. And, it's that kind of stuff. He becomes really the governor. He's the one that they're all afraid of now, I think.
Particularly with the farmhouse scene, where he is
Brilliant.
almost... It's like one of those scenes in a movie where two angry gods are fighting each other, but obviously Varvara isn't quite as godlike as Nightingale in the end.
Varvara talks about, how superior he is and the skills that he's displayed. From the past, obviously, she cites his reputation and obviously completely respects the skills that he has. So I thought that was quite telling as well.
I think Nightingale's problem, he clearly does know more than the Faceless Man, but his problem is that he has not been keeping up to date. He's been in the Folly, assuming that the era of magic was over, and things have happened that he hasn't been aware of. We talked about him not knowing about the quiet people, but also there's a few other aspects of Peter discovers that Nightingale doesn't know. So Nightingale's kind of been reactivated, almost like a sleeper agent from the 1940s, as it were.
This has been going on for quite some time, because Varvara says that she turned the Albert Gentleman character in 2003. So at least 10 or 11 years that he's starting to realise that an awful lot's been going on, that he's been completely oblivious to in terms of the little crocodiles and potentially the new faceless man. And she gives an awful lot away that he begins to realise why she's quite important. And she knows that giving this information to him makes her important and therefore safe, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think they are revealing, sort of unravelling, as it were, the character of Nightingale about the right speed. Because it's always tricky. I mean, the two things that are always very hard in these sorts of dramas is, one, the couple. Will they get it together? When will they get it together? Mm-hmm. Will we still be interested after they've got it together? And obviously Peter and Lesley have spun off on a completely different direction. The other one is the enigmatic character that everyone loves who isn't in it much but turns up and steals the scene. Do you have them in it too much or not? Or sometimes overexpose them? I think in this case we're learning a bit more about Nightingale every time. He's not in it too much, and just when you think he's not in it at all, he suddenly turns up and steals the
day.
whole show. By definition, he almost couldn't be involved in the Skygarden Tower incident because it would have made it too similar to the Soho rooftop incident at the end of book 2. He couldn't be around to intervene and save Peter again on that one. So it's quite convenient he had to man mark or woman mark Vivara in terms of making sure because she's clearly still very powerful, so presumably he had to be on hand to keep her under lock and key.
That's another one that's had to be introduced into the Folly. So you've got all sorts of people that end up there for various reasons, fleetingly. We had Zach there. Now Lesley arrived semi-permanently until the end of this book, and then Vivara.
And don't forget, Abigail's turning up for her junior apprentice lessons.
Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, she's quite smart, isn't she? She was quite skillful talking to George Knopfler, and she seems to be able to give the right answers when it looked as if Peter wasn't quite sure how to respond to Knopfler's questions. So she's showing a quickness about her, quickness of thought, promising.
Very bold
for...
Yes.
Yeah.
From the Isle of Dogs to the IOU, in a drinker sits a thinker with a scabby new tattoo. London is inspired, but I'm tired. Let's go to bed.
Talking of the Spring Court, what was interesting for me about that was these sort of set pieces are becoming a feature of the books, where we attend something at which the huge cast of characters tend to turn up, and it did underline to me what a huge cast of characters by book 4 we have got now.
Yeah.
What supporting characters for you were you frustrated didn't feature enough in this book? Which characters that have come along for this book intrigued you the most? Jan, we're now 4 books in. I know in book 1 you were a big fan of Lady Ty. Do you feel you've had enough Lady Ty at all since then?
No, I'd be very happy to see more of her. And this time we got bits of Beverly. I think I would like to have seen a bit more of her. I tell you, they were sort of archetypal characters really, but I did like the family in the tower, Betsy and Kevin and Sasha. I thought they were quite lively introductions, but it did remind me a little bit of an EastEnders plot, that you have a new family introduced and sort of they're quite distinctive to begin with, just so that you understand what they are. So they're almost a little bit of a cliche. So, but there was something about them that I quite liked. They were quite a sort of warm group of characters that I don't know whether they just literally appear for this one. I presume they do because they were very much part of the Skygarden Tower. But I could see them turning up on another occasion.
Given the state of the estate and the fact that, as we found when Peter was trying to evacuate people, it's a sink estate, it's on its last legs, they're trying to pull it down. So inevitably the kind of people that would gravitate towards the Skygarden Tower or the estate itself, they're going to be different, they're going to be more extreme probably, and that's what you kind of find with those people.
In terms of Back to the Spring Court, obviously I was delighted that Beverly's back because I really like Beverly, but that was quite intriguing because they were dropping things all the way through about Peter and her.
Yeah.
I loved the fact that Peter's mum was back in and having a go at Peter. I loved that.
Yeah.
And always like to have Peter's mum around because she's sort of funny but also reality check for Peter as well. So yes, and I quite liked. It was interesting. I mean, they were a plot device, but Nikki and Sky.
Yeah.
Although Sky comes up later, but that whole thing about how he links the actual garden to the wood nymph and the that I liked all of that because that kind of linked it back to the rivers rather than it just being there because it was there type thing.
I'd like to see more of Ty and Ephra and Beverly because you know they're part of one family and all we see is the Father Thames versus Mother Thames, and I think the warring daughters in that family would be an extremely good line to go down.
Some of us were a little bit critical of Whispers Underground and the unnecessary plot threads that were in it, the sort of how it all came together. I think Richard even thought it could have been stripped back to a novella. And I was mentioning to Richard that actually the Whispers Underground is 50 pages longer than the book that we've just read, Broken Homes. So did it all make sense? Did it all come together?
Out of all the ones that we've read so far, this to me was the one that could be a complete standalone. I think it would be fine if you didn't read any of those before because you picked up enough about what had gone on. So there was no loads of explanation of what had gone before.
No.
But there was, I thought it had everything. I was trying to remember the thing. So it had got the strong police procedural thing. We'd got romance. We'd got, if you can call it romance, with Lesley and Zach, Peter and Beverly, and the ongoing Lesley and Peter. I thought the friendship was really well established between Peter and Lesley and Nightingale and Waleed as well. There was lots of humour. There was, I think there were 6 deaths in it. We'd got the poignancy of the death of Sky. There was the history, looking at the Horseshoe Estate in Berlin. You've got the history of London and Southwark, the mystery, what will Lesley do next? I thought it had everything, actually. It's definitely the most complete book, I think, out of the ones that we've read so far.
Yeah, me too. High body count, much higher than last time, which is a good thing in a horror stroke crime novel. Lots of interesting new theories and explanations, including the whole concept of making people do stuff, making people throw themselves under trains, or I thought that was really interesting and opens up all sorts of possibilities for things that can happen in future books and maybe better explanations of things that happened in this one. There was a bit of politics in the Southwark Council and development issues which were all present in that estate, and I looked up what's happened to it now, and it's just horrendous. It's Elephant Park. It's this massive new development, all hugely expensive apartments sold to mostly foreign investors, so a bit more politics.
Skygarden is fictitious but based on an existing, I can't remember the name of it.
It's called Haygate.
It's
called Haygate Estate.
It's the big one that was you could see from Elephant and Castle Station as you pulled by.
Yeah. And used for lots of movies, where especially where people were, lots of criminals and people hanging out and trying to disappear on the estate. And it was a real sink estate. But I was fascinated by things that were real but renamed, like West Hill House in Highgate, the National Trust place, which was relocated to Highgate. I think it was meant to be, although he didn't reference this in his notes at the end of the book, I think it was meant to be To the Willows, or whatever it's called, which was the home of Erno Goldfinger, who was, I suspect, the inspiration for Eric Stromberg, in that he was Hungarian rather than German, but he was an architect. And I think there was just so much to go at in this book. It was just gripping.
I think from my perspective, it flows more logically for me. Gradually, all points lead to Skygarden Tower, then moving into the tower in the second half of the book. Seeding early on the idea of a magic wand being a storer of magical power. And then, of course, we end up with effectively the faceless man trying to turn a whole tower block into a magic wand, and then linked into the solution being in the architecture, because they talk about Stadtkrone, city crowns.
Yeah.
That's what Peter at the last minute realises is what can release that energy and stop the faceless man absorbing it into his dog batteries that are in the lockups.
But surprisingly, he didn't know about it.
He's not quite as clever. He's not the... he's a fearsome foe, but he's not just good. And that can sometimes be a problem in drama, that you set the villain up as being so incredibly powerful and perfect that when they are defeated, it seems a bit weak. You find their Achilles heel and you deal with it. So I loved all the German stuff because I speak a bit of German. So reading when Peter's translating the German, I would pause and try and work out if I could understand what it was. Which is quite fun.
Well, you know what I'm going to say, and I really liked it, is the fact that Peter didn't go back in time anywhere. So that was really good for me. That happened a couple of times, so I'm quite happy that didn't happen.
No astral voyaging.
No astral voyaging, although there was a reference to Gallifrey, I have to say,
Yes, I
and the
noticed
door, and I
that.
thought,
Yes,
unless you knew about Doctor Who, you had that one.
That's not the only reference to Doctor Who in this book.
No, there's loads. But it's loads.
Unusually,
but,
they haven't been in previous books.
I liked the pace of it. I liked the fact that I didn't feel there was too much that was too detailed. He was quite taut in the plot. But what I also liked was there were only two sort of really big scenes. There wasn't like the end and then another scene and then another scene. The two big pivotal things were Essex and Nightingale, and then the different thing with Peter and the tower block, and that was it. And that was enough, and you didn't need any more. And for me, that was great. And I thought it really moved it really, really quickly compared perhaps to Whispers Underground, where you had Peter going down the sewer and then doing this and doing that. So I really, really appreciated that it was very tight, but still was gripping all the way through, that I didn't feel that there was an awful lot that was spare or could have been edited out. Do you know what I mean? So that was really good.
I agree.
Yeah, agree.
Particularly in the description of everything leading up to the second encounter on the rooftop. He's never going to go on a rooftop again, is Peter. Panicked attempt to get people out, and how the families who were already there were helping him in that, and that was just beautifully described.
Yeah, it was good, really good.
Yeah, the last couple of chapters really whiz by when you're reading it. So, any final thoughts then about the book? Where do we think the story's headed? Where do we want it to head?
I'm desperate to know what's going to happen with the Lesley story. So I hope that's not left for too long before we find out what happens to her. I hope we don't go a whole book with Lesley only referred to but not actually appearing. So that's my priority. What did Lesley do next?
Yeah, I'd probably say the same thing. I think that the only thing I might have done if I was him was end it at penultimate chapter when Lesley and Faceless Man walk away. Because I think after that I was just, oh my God. And then suddenly you're thrust into, a bit of admin and standing in front of committees and things like that. And that just felt as if he could have ended it on a much more exciting note.
Sorry to interrupt, it's interesting you say that. Do books often do that though? I get that films and plays and TV shows often do that, but the books often end that abruptly.
I think series of books do, and this is now definitely a series. If you read this as a standalone, as Jan was talking about, then I'm not sure that those final few pages would have made much difference to you. They don't really explain anything.
No,
if the final chapter explains stuff, that's one thing, but it doesn't. It's just like, okay, how are we going to handle this before we have to really think about it? I suspect, but I don't want it to be, I'm not even going to look at you two to see how you react. I suspect there's nothing about Lesley in the next book, and it's more about, they think it's over. They think with the faceless woman and the faceless man being preoccupied with building faces, that it's over and Peter will be distraught and will probably get together with Beverly. I think it's going to be another seriously evil, plot-driven book. I hope, anyway.
I think I'm right in saying it's Margaret's favourite book next, isn't it?
Yes, I hope so. But having said that, having reread the books, you sometimes get a different perspective. Yeah. And I think the thing is, we're reading the books much closer in time than when we read them before. I'm hoping Foxglove Summer, which is coming up, is still my favourite. But I have to say, having compared this one to Whispers Underground, and I really enjoyed the pace of this one. And even though I knew what was going to happen at the end, it was still a shock to me, even though I knew it was coming. So that's a sign of, I think, of it, that it was really well plotted. So from that perspective, a bit like Richard and Whispers Underground, I'm going to park that until we've read Foxglove Summer. But at the moment it is, and at the moment it's still my mother's favourite one. But again, she's rereading all the way through, so that might change too. So we'll just have to wait and see until we reconvene.
Mum has finished her reread, and I can confirm on her behalf that Foxglove Summer is still her favourite book. So, we're now 4 novels in, with 8 published so far, and Ben Aaronovitch contracted for a further 3. Those of you who are long-term Rivers of London fans may know that the series actually takes 4 formats. The core novels that we're discussing here are very much the essential part, but there are also novellas, short stories, and a series of graphic novels. Effectively, these other formats work around the novels, filling in gaps and expanding some of the characters. They're not vital. If you just read the novels, then all is fine. However, it's after Broken Homes, as the series started to become a franchise, in inverted commas, that these other forms of content kick in. The first graphic novel, Bodywork, follows directly after Broken Homes, as Peter and Nightingale investigate cars with an afterlife of their own. Meanwhile, it's fairly common knowledge if you're on Twitter that at the time of recording this podcast, Ben Aaronovitch has just finished a novella called What Abigail Did Last Summer, which actually runs in parallel with the next book we'll be reviewing, Foxglove Summer. We also know that a book of short stories is due out just 2 weeks from now at the time of recording this podcast, released on the 31st of July 2020. I suspect some of these short stories would have appeared as bonus material in the paperback versions of later books. I find that a really irritating thing that publishers do, as it penalises the fans who buy the hardbacks when they first come out by giving extra content in the hope that they'll buy the paperback as well. I didn't do that, so I'm looking forward to seeing what I missed. It's currently only £4.31 on Amazon for the ebook, so what the hell. Anyway, in our next episode, we're looking at Foxglove Summer, Novel 5, but after that we may well take a quick detour to look at the first 2 graphic novels, Bodywork and The Night Witch. You can probably guess what the second one is about.
So, thanks for listening. If you'd enjoyed the podcast, please send us your thoughts about Broken Homes or any other of the first 4 books to our email at follypodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on our website, thefollycast.com. The references we mention will also be in the show notes there. As Richard says, the next episode we'll be looking at is Foxglove Summer, perfectly timed as we head now into August. A shell-shocked Peter travels to the countryside to recover, but Beverly Brook and trouble are not far behind.
Finally, the Follycast theme you've been hearing is London is inspired by Cutwater, and links to their site are in the show notes. Be seeing you.